Hey, what's up everybody? Killing for Company, my name's Kellen, and today we got something going on. Similar to what I was doing around this time last year, I wanted to do a special entry into a series that will be ongoing for this channel, and I'm calling it Blood from Stone, and it's just a period focus. So 90s American traditional heavy metal. The first video I did was on Cauldron Born, and today the band that we're going to be talking about, it's spicy, is called Skullview. So I have 3 CDs here from Skullview. They're the RIP Records years, and we'll get into that here in a second. Just a little bit of a background on the band. So this time period for me is a bit of a interest, similar to my cut your teeth death metal series from the 2000s. American traditional heavy metal during this time period is very much absent, is not popular. If you were wanting to play in a style like Manowar during this time period, it was not cool, right? Everyone was either you were in the early 90s, you were probably listening to grunge. If you were into extreme metal, you were listening to death metal and black metal. Later on in the 90s, things like nu metal were popular, and even in more traditional heavy metal circles, around this time period where Skullview first appears, it's a major, I would say, focus for traditional heavy metal is happening in, here's Skullview by the way, with the likes of Hammerfall. I think the first Hammerfall full length is around the 1998. And that's important here, just because we'll kind of get into a little bit of contrast between what Skullview has to offer, or what Cauldron Born had to offer, in comparison to what is happening in Europe, and why this period is so interesting to me is there's just this absence, right, historically, of this sound. So if you were going to play this, you had to do it from a standpoint of the only thing that is important is our passion for this music and keeping it alive and playing the music that we love. And right now, within this resurgence of newer traditional heavy metal bands that sort of appeared over the past almost decade, right? 2014, 2015 becomes, you know, a larger influx of bands start to appear. So for those bands who held on from 1990 to somewhere in the 2014, 2015, and really fought for the survival and made traditional heavy metal important. You know, Skullview is a part of that, Cauldron Born's a part of that, and so we're going to go over those first 3 records from Cauldron Born today. Before we jump into that, in the background I'm listening to Memorialist, newer traditional heavy metal band from Portland. This is a 22 release, so really new. But we'll listen to that in the background there, and let's get into Skullview. So this band appears they're from Indiana, and a group of guys who worked in the steel mills in Indiana and various sort of construction jobs, who shared a similar passion for traditional heavy metal. put together this project, Skullview, and they originally released a demo in 1997. The demo came out, after reading some interviews, after they were originally signed to RIP Records. So they, I don't know if there was a connection. They knew who, King Fowley is sort of got his October 31st project going on at this time, and Deceased is also gaining in popularity. Bands Cauldron Born, like they're all happening in this sort of region, right? Kentucky, Indiana, parts of the South and Midwest. So RIP signs the band to a 3-record deal, and the first one that comes out is Legends of Valor. The demo was self-released. This is our first RIP release, and the artwork here is from the same, let me get the name correct, same artist who did many of the most iconic works for Manowar. Ken Kelly. There we go. I got it right. So Ken Kelly is part of the artwork here. He also does the Suffer No Guilt Gates of Slumber release, that's like very reminiscent. I'll show a picture somewhere of that, of the Gates of Slumber album cover. But when I first saw this album artwork, the first thing I thought was it reminded me of Gates of Slumber, but I'd never heard of Skullview. I knew, looking at the date, that it was going to be some kind of traditional heavy metal, but in a weird time period, right? So Skullview's sound is very much drawing on parts of traditional heavy metal that even start prior to the epic or power metal that was going on in the 1980s in America. So they have an equal amount of fascination with the likes of Black Sabbath or Deep Purple. Elements of the new wave of British heavy metal, so Maiden, Priest, that transition into the American power, epic side of things. But they emerge here in the late 90s, really. And so they grew up with the likes of Metallica and Slayer. The first and second wave of black metal are, part of their metal vocabulary. So is death metal. Bands Sadistic Intent and Autopsy are part of that California death metal scene. They have talked about in interviews as being another source of an influence. So it matters that they are not just trying to sound like an Omen or Manowar clone. There's a darker side to this, and you can tell there's an additional element to that artwork, right, where it looks a little bit more, right, definitely pulling from Manowar and Frank Franzetta, that sword and sorcery thing, but there's a level of violence here that takes it a step up, right? Like there's some extreme metal in their DNA. Now, Legends of Valor, and we'll kind of get into comparisons later on, but has a darker, doomier sound here. So that Sabbath influence, or even the likes of maybe Candlemass, this is a darker, slower, doomier record. But if you're still looking for that Manowar sort of epic feel, you'll find it here. They played a handful of shows, and they definitely needed, though, more exposure. It's a time period, right, where it's really hard for people to get into this. So outside of the Midwest region, didn't venture very far, didn't get a whole lot of opportunity to sort of put their sound out there outside of the Midwest and South. Until their second release comes around here, Kings of the Universe. I'll pull this out so you can take a look at the artwork. Now this album art was done by an artist who did some of the Absu releases. His name, so Chris Bearwimp, did the album artwork here, and we see a consistent theme with what the Skullview calls the warrior, the sort of battle axe wielding figure there. So he's a consistent part of their album covers. And so Legends of Valor comes out in 1998, and we get Kings of the Universe in 99. So just a year turnaround. So to my point about them not touring a lot, or their sound was very much focused as getting this first record out, and then all right, we got to go record on some new stuff. So they released Kings of the Universe, and stylistically, in terms of the sound, it is a little bit more of the traditional heavy metal, pulling away from the doomier aspects. So the new wave of British heavy metal becomes a greater influence here, thrash, and to some extent sort of tertiary influences from extreme metal, right? Like the vocal delivery by the lead vocalist, Mike Earthquake Quimby Lewis. He has like an interesting kind of aggressive delivery that is much more akin to that American power metal or epic sound, or American power metal. Like it almost bears some semblance to thrash, and I think there was some criticism from the traditional heavy metal community that it was not polished enough, right? If you're listening to Blind Guardian, Skullview is going to sound really rough, but for their kind of audience, their kind of sound, in terms of appealing to that American fan base, like it's absolutely on point, right? It's not trying to sound like European power metal. And given the fact that they're working in this kind of blue-collar environment and have no other aspirations other than making traditional heavy metal that they love, I think it's absolutely on point. The songs here, though, like the production is better. There's a little bit more of a greater sense of professionalism in seeing growth from Legends of Valor to Kings of the Universe. The song structure has become a bit more complicated. There's greater dynamic range, better musicianship. So everyone kind of steps up their game. And I think if you're a traditional heavy metal fan who's not interested in like the doomier and darker aspects, you want something to kind of compare from this band to the more iconic pieces of epic heavy metal or American power metal from the 80s, Kings of the Universe is going to be my recommendation for you. It's a great record, and I kind of prefer the darker, heavier side of Legends of Valor, but both, contend for the best of this band's output. I'm just going to be talking about the RIP record years, which are the first three. They kind of cluster together, and when we get to the end, I'll get to different record. But so anyway, that is Skullview and Kings of the Universe.
You awaken from the lost, the streets of pain from the burning cross. If you believe in the dragon, cross the heart of the mighty end. Never fear us returning back. Hold on tight, feel the aching breath.
I will put like separate photos for all this stuff, so you get a chance to look at the album artwork while I'm talking about it. Because it's, that battle axe wielding, sword and sorcery stuff is part of the reason that you would enjoy this. So I want to make sure you get a chance to look at it. And then in 2001, I believe. Yes. Brief note on distribution, right? So I was mentioning how they did not get a lot of exposure in this time period, like many of the traditional or power metal bands from America in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. Massacre Records picked Kings of the Universe up for distribution in Europe, and from the interviews that I came across with the band, it did not go over well. Like RIP Records was disappointed that whatever the exchange was between the two labels did not go over well. So this got European distribution, but it was the only Massacre sort of European version that was released before RIP and Massacre sort of parted ways with their relationship regarding Skullview. So 2001, we get Consequences of Failure. And pull that up there for you. So on this one, I would say the band has substantial amount of growth. For when a band takes chances and does something a little bit different, there's two sides to that coin, right? Whereas the transition from Valor to Universe, it was like they had honed in and concentrated in they knew where they were going in terms of the direction of their sound. Consequences of Failure, there are moments of this where their more extreme metal influences become apparent. Once again, also we get artwork by Chris Verworm. But there's moments where there's like a black metal riffing and that transitions to death metal riffing in a way that pushed past essentially where Universe had greater roots in the like metal church jag panzer sort of deal. Like that's kind of how aggressive Universe got. This takes it to the next level, right? There's that kind of experimentation where the sound wanted to go somewhere else that felt like, is just as much as the bands that they listened to. They wanted a piece of that kind of aggression. And it comes in through Consequences. The other part that I can't help but I feel like I need to mention is the vocals here also seem at times a bit of a distraction. So there are a few tracks in particular that I wanted to bring up. So when you get into the intro to Leviticus, for example, or I think it's Wrath of the Sorcerer, it's like the vocalist is trying to do too much. So Quimby ends up sort of putting multiple tracks. You have like this falsetto and a couple of tracks of like the gruffer, meaner stuff that are just doubled, or I don't know if he's trying to add a greater sense of weight or harmony, but they're almost like overdone to the point where he feels like he's compensating. Where I feel on the earlier records when it was really just one voice, or maybe if he wanted to add a little bit of harmony. I know there are some guest vocals that the band jumps in, but it feels crowded at times vocally. Or the band doesn't trust that just alone a single vocalist could carry the band in terms of being a focal identity. So I got distracted a couple times with Consequences, or at least I needed to back off, or was a bit sort of confused as to what they were going for. That being said, Leviticus ends with a bit more of that like extreme metal dynamic transition. Same thing can be said with, a major highlight is Armed with an Axe, and the opener, Time for Violence, right? That song initially is kind of, it just gets right to it where you're kind of put off guard. You don't have any like major swing that brings you into the album, but by the end, when they make that dynamic shift, move towards something a bit more aggressive and heavy and faster, like where they introduce some velocity to the sound, it makes tons of sense, and you are at that point completely immersed in the general narrative. Other thing to say is, like I mentioned about it getting a little bit crowded. This comes in at an hour long, and there's like a track where it is spoken word trying to, I think it's called The Archmage. It's just a couple of minutes of this spoken word, and they're trying to bring like a sense of lyrical or concept narrative to the record. But I think they could have reined in a little bit of their ambition on this to try and concentrate it where there was no sort of, it didn't feel like everything was sort of superfluous and it wasn't needed. So a lot of growth here on this record, but at the same time they're taking chances and they land it occasionally. Other times it doesn't go as well as potentially what they wanted.
You're armed with an axe. Born to fight, a warrior's way to prove his bravery, not to kill.
When I was talking about distribution, this was actually picked up by Iron Bonehead for a vinyl pressing. So it got some European distribution and a vinyl release. But that ends sort of my RIP Skullview. I think if you were looking for recommendations, the first two I think are the classic, in my opinion. So I'm pulling them out of the jewel case so you can look at the artwork here. But we get Legends of Valor in 98, Kings of the Universe here in 99. So those are the ones you want to check out that get my sort of, an introduction to the band. Great place to start if you're interested in like that 90's or curious as to what traditional heavy metal in America sounds like during this time period. These are the two to check out. This is a really intriguing listen, and kind of was could have served as a launching pad for the band to go into something further. But that being said, they kind of stop at 2001, and the band sort of dissolves. And they've got various projects that they're a part of in the Indiana metal scene. Now they did come back and put out an album in 2010 called Metakill the World, and that was on Pure Steel Records. There's a new vocalist there, and I don't own that one. I've just listened to it a handful of times. If you're curious, to go out and check that, but it kind of, in terms of the dating, pushes me past where I want to focus on for this Blood from Stone series. So that's all I really got for you on Skullview. I'm going to continue to do this series, and I don't know if it'll just be an annual, like once a year. I'll focus on an American traditional heavy metal band from the 90's and sort of early 2000s. But it's a sort of forgotten piece of American heavy metal history, and I think it's worth mentioning. And for all those musicians and metalheads who never stopped loving what was at its peak essentially in the 1980s and kept sort of fighting where the stream is heading in the opposite direction, like they fought against the stream and momentum of where metal was going in the 1990s, only here to find out in the 2010 plus that it has come back in full force, and there's a whole resurgence of traditional heavy metal bands. Now, many of them are influenced by the 80s and those of that iconic era, but for those musicians who have potentially not earned their time, in the spotlight, or being recognized for trying to keep it alive, this series I want to dedicate to those musicians and those artists, those bands. So if you're a traditional heavy metal band from the 1990s, this series is going to be dedicated to you. And thank you for keeping it going and making sure that American traditional heavy metal still has a place today. So that's all I got for you. I'll see you guys later. Bye.